legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffitt, and my guest today is Richard Kretz, who joins us to discuss the so-called Age of Aquarius and the potential for planetary change. For millennia, humans have gazed at the stars, seeking meaning in their patterns. Today, a growing chorus senses a shift, an electric hum of change in the air, hard to name but impossible to ignore. For many, most of the tectonic changes now underway on Earth are profoundly negative. Political, social, economic, and environmental crises, coupled with growing conflict, and trends in technology and artificial intelligence, all of which threaten the very existence of the human race. Weaving together astrology, astronomy, and mythology, Kretz proposes that although the future looks highly uncertain, a metamorphosis is currently underway, disrupting old patterns, awakening new awareness, and restructuring for what is to come. As in the past, earthly upheavals seem to be mirrored by events elsewhere in the solar system and wider cosmic rhythms. The total solar eclipse of March 2034 may be important, but it's our choices that will shape what comes next. Hello and welcome, Richard, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Well, thank you, Greg. I enjoy returning, and it's always a pleasure to converse with you and your listeners.
Oh, well, thanks so much for that. Right back at you. So today, we're going to be talking about the headline, or the title of the talk, The Age of Aquarius. But in my recorded introduction, I've said a little bit about what listeners can expect from that. But before we dive into our topic today, for listeners who don't know, just give them a little bit of information about your background and your work in general.
Well, it's a pretty diverse background. The simple version is that I published a book about 2 years ago on the alchemical search for the unified field, and we've had a few discussions about that. I've been formally trained in transcendental meditation as taught by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and I've practiced and studied meditation, consciousness, shamanism, and the occult sciences for more than 50 years.
Yeah, well, it's quite some record, really. And as you say, we did have a conversation around your book, and listeners will find a link to that interview on the webpage for this talk. So, to get started, the Age of Aquarius, I said a little bit about that in my introduction. So I'm going to get you to set out, because you've written a quite a long text on this. It's usually setting out a lot of ideas and concepts and research that you've done on this, which is not set for publication as such, but you did a boil down, which you also sent to me, a shorter article. But Age of Aquarius, for some people who are a bit familiar, they'll be thinking about, the ages of the Earth relating to astrology and astronomy, and how this affects events on the Earth, sort of physical and physiological, from a human point of view, but, shifts in human affairs, shall we say, and that's where the astrological dimension really comes in. So maybe just in whatever way you'd like to, just get us started with a bit of your thoughts on the headline of all that.
Okay, that's a good introduction. What got me started on this is, of course, I've got a background in it. So it's on my mind quite a bit. But there seems to be this, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, an electric hum of change in the air, as though, something is forthcoming. And we really don't know what it might be, but it's palpable. It's something that we can almost feel that there is something going on. So, for example, a Tesla's point of view, is it energy, frequency, and vibration? What is it? What's it all about? And then, concurrently, we hear this discussion of the age of Aquarius. And when I looked at that from an astrological perspective, what I found is that for the most part, astrology, is an interesting tool. It's fun to play with, even though it can be quite technical. But generally speaking, it's no more accurate than a weatherman. It really isn't able to pin things down precisely with, a comfortable degree of accuracy. So, where's this feeling emanating from? So it's got to be more than just this idea of the planets in procession, around the Earth and around the sun. It has to involve the constellations in some way, gravity, and how does, ancient mythology factor into this? Astronomy in general, specifically, total eclipses of the sun. So, we're weaving this really, broad and colorful tapestry to see if there are indications that, we could use it as a tool to not only become aware of what has happened in the past, but perhaps foretell the future. If that's the case, what is this age of Aquarius all about? Um, you know, is it the dawn of enlightenment and unity, a technological leap, where we're finding there's a symbiotic relationship between us and the machines out there with the introduction recently of artificial intelligence? So where is all this going? And what is the marker for that? And that was my question. So what I did, Greg, is in that first, uh, I guess, paper or whatever you want to call it, when I was sharing my research with you, it was over 30,000 words. I'm looking at all these things, my research and trying to figure it out. And it keeps coming back to the most common thread is that there is a total solar eclipse that is going to occur on the vernal equinox or the spring equinox, March 20th of 2034. Well, why is that particular total solar eclipse important? Well, it's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, when we're looking at an astrological age change, where the sun's position in front of a constellation shifts, marking the end of an age or the beginning of a new age, it always occurs on a spring equinox. And these occurrences run 1,000 and 2,200 years apart. So, I found that interesting that there was an upcoming total solar eclipse going to be on the spring equinox. Hey, that's cool. But what is there beyond that makes it intriguing? Well, when we go back and we start looking at the ancient stories from the Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, and all of that, we find a reference to some of the constellations and how they tied their various deities or connected them with the constellations in the sky. And I'll share a brief story with you, one that pertains to the god's name was Tammuz. He was also known as Dumuzi. He was represented in the sky as the asterism, and asterism is slightly different than a constellation, although Orion is often referred to as a constellation. It's not. But anyway, so we'll talk briefly about Orion for a moment. Now, Orion is considered a hunter. It's a constellation that's always been, identified. The pyramids in Egypt are aligned to the stars of Orion's belt, as are the pyramids in South America, in Teotihuacan in Mexico. So, half a world apart, and yet we've got these pyramids that are aligned in the same to the same constellation. So there must be some importance there. So what's the story of Orion? Well, it's actually the story of Tammuz. And way back when these gods were first coming to Earth, the story of Tammuz is that he was married to the mother of all living, and her name was Inanna. And the sexual mores back then were nothing like what they are today. Pretty much anything goes, with the exception of rape, which was severely penalized, and marriage of full-blooded siblings. They didn't go for that either for some reason, although they were able to enjoy the entertainment of it. So anyway, Tammuz has this, he's married to Inanna, considered the mother of all living, and he wants to have a relationship with his sister, Geshtanana. Now, Geshtanana was known as the goddess of the grape and fertility, and referred to as the vine of heaven. Well, he conspires with his wife, Inanna, to enjoy his sister during a picnic. Well, it didn't go so well. He ends up raping her, and he is banished. And while he was in exile, he ends up getting in a fight with Inanna's sister's husband and kills him. Well, Inanna's sister her name was Ereshkigal, and she was the goddess of the underworld. And of course, she was furious, sends demons up and drags Tammuz to the underworld. Well, Inanna wasn't too happy about that, so she travels to the underworld to meet with her sister, Ereshkigal, and attempts to bargain for his release. Unfortunately, Ereshkigal kills Inanna. In the interim, Tammuz's sister, Geshtanana, publicly forgives Tammuz for his trespassing, and she too travels to the underworld, meets with Ereshkigal, and the deal that they make is that Ereshkigal will allow Tammuz to return to Earth for 6 months of the year, between the fall equinox and the spring equinox. Geshtanana will take his place in the underworld during that time, and she returns to the Earth in the spring, between the spring equinox and the fall equinox. So what does this have to do with Orion? Everything. Because when we look at Orion, Orion is considered to be born at just before sunrise in the east at the fall equinox. It heralds his return to the earth. By the winter solstice, Orion is standing upright in the south at about midnight. And then he continues to rotate in a clockwise manner so that during the spring equinox in March, he's face down and dying. And during the summer solstice, he's not seen, or we're not able to see him in the northern hemisphere. That's a very familiar theme for those of you that are going to think about that. On the flip side of that, we find that Geshtanana is represented by the constellation of Virgo and the planet Venus. And she begins to rise at the spring equinox, is standing, at her full height during the summer solstice, and begins to die or to return to the underworld during the fall equinox. So this is how the ancients were able to describe the cycles of, life, death, and resurrection, because it's an ongoing thing. Every year, Orion is reborn in September, and every year, Geshtanana is reborn at the spring equinox. So that's part of the reason that a total solar eclipse is important on the spring equinox. It symbolizes Geshtanana's return to the earth and the rebirth that we experience every year, such as we're beginning to experience right now, with flowers starting to bloom and the trees are budding. So it's part of the rebirth cycle. So on March 20th in 2034, we find that there is a total solar eclipse. It begins off of the coast of Brazil, which is in the southern hemisphere, at sunrise. Now, that is important because in the southern hemisphere, it's actually, we would think that, it's the fall equinox, but it's not. It's the spring equinox. Excuse me, the other way around. In March, down in Brazil, or the southern hemisphere, is actually the fall equinox. So at that time, Orion is considered to be born. And then this total eclipse, it transits in a northeasterly direction, and we find it crosses the equator, and it comes into the northern hemisphere, where it is the spring equinox. So what we find is that when the eclipse begins, it's the spring equinox down in the southern hemisphere, the fall equinox. So that's where Orion is being born. And then he comes to the equator, and he's risen as an upright man. He transits into the northern hemisphere, where he, of course, dies. And that could represent the astrological sign of Pisces. In contrast, when we're looking at the constellation of Virgo, down in the southern hemisphere in March, it's again the fall equinox. So, Virgo would be considered to be passing. It crosses the equator, and as it enters into the northern hemisphere, it's a rebirth. So we have death and rebirth occurring simultaneously. In other words, it's the passing of the age of Pisces and a transition to the new age of Aquarius. Does that make sense, Greg?
Absolutely it does. It just reminds us, the kind of, when talking about mythology, what the role it has had in preserving and passing down knowledge and and stories throughout human history. And the word myth, for example, in the modern age has become synonymous with something that just is made up, is just not true, whereas it's much more nuanced than that. And then also, in what you were saying, as a reminder of the ancients, seeing life if not consciousness, in everything and personifying things. The entire cosmos was alive. The sun is alive. The sun is conscious. All the planetary bodies have their consciousness, their personality, or whatever it happens to be, and it's not just humans, right down to every object and creature on the earth. It's all part of like one interconnected system, and everything you've set out there highlights how that works in that context. How, let's say, these stories are told and how events are interpreted and linked together, and that's something that we kind of lost touch with, in the just the industrial revolution and the scientific revolution and everything else. Things became atomized. That's the scientific approach, isn't it, to dissect things in order to understand them. So everything you've just set out is just a very, elegant, as people quite often do when they're interpreting, people, places, and events and whatnot, and the passage of time and past, present, and future in astrological terms, is just a much more holistic picture of how things work.
Absolutely. And the beauty of it is that our ancestors were very nature-based, they're very in touch with nature, and they used, the stars to tell the stories or to explain what they were experiencing and observing. And it's a beautiful thing, really, when you think about it, and very simple.
Yes, I mean, I've spoken not only with yourself, but many other guests on the topic of astrology, but also astronomy, and of course the two tied together. And although you're treating them somewhat differently, there was a time when it was really one science. Well, it's like a spiritual science, I suppose, almost you could say. As popularized, the terms by Rudolf Steiner. But these pursuits were not necessarily seen as separate. A lot of the scientific, I should say, the heroes of the modern scientific age, were basically occultists on one level. They had these other interests that are not so well documented, or at least not so well publicized, shall we say. So, and I would refer people and listeners who are interested, our talk on your book, for example, is somewhere to go. My interview with Bruce Schofield and how astrology works. My interviews with John Michael Greer, particularly the one on the relatively recent downgrading of Pluto from planet status, for example. And he sets out how that says a great deal about the age we're living in and the transition that we're in. And although I've not interviewed Richard Tarnas, I was reminded when I was reading your piece sort of a commonality there, and just the elegance of the astrological system, when again tied in with astronomy. It's really for me is like dividing this into astrology and astronomy is kind of doing both a disservice in a way, because clearly, even on a purely materialistic level, in astronomy, there are kinetic effects on the Earth and on life on Earth by the planetary bodies, not, the sun being the most obvious ones, but there's all sorts of other physical forces that come into play, gravity, cosmic rays, all sorts of things. And never mind the Earth's journey around the sun, our solar system's journey around the galactic center, which takes hundreds of thousands of years. The solar system passes through so many different regions with so many different physical properties, some of them quite challenging in terms of radiation, etc. So all of this, of course, is going to have an effect on life on Earth and on our, not only our physiology, but our psychology. And all of that plays out then in human events. So this is all one massive interconnected web. And I think as a non-expert in either astrology or astronomy, it's one of the reasons I find it all so compelling, especially when it's brought together.
Yeah, exactly. And as you've noted, in the past, astronomy and astrology were considered as one topic, just one tool. And all the influences that you were referencing there, the simple way that I think of it is that, you've got all these forces that are having an effect. And to some extent, science will say that, oh, you can't prove it. But then I think myself, okay, well, I don't agree with that. In that, you know, let's take the moon as an example, by itself. The moon itself, its gravitational forces impacts the tides of the seas. Okay, high tides and low tides. It impacts, a woman's menses. So, if the moon can do that, what about the interplay of all of these other planetary and cosmic forces? What is that, as you're pointing out? How is that impacting our behavior and our psychology? And ultimately, events as they play out, throughout history and even in our time. It's a cosmic clock, you know, um, and it's driven by, the precession of these cosmic bodies, as well as the total solar eclipses, I think, are just markers. And symbolically, when you think about a total solar eclipse, it is a cosmic reference to the union of opposites between male and female. When the moon or the moon and the sun unite together to create this wondrous event that, throughout human history, we've noted with both awe and concern. And the same thing goes for, your comets and novas and things of that nature. And then too, we have to factor in, to this galactic dance, the magnetic pole shift, as these things all come together as ripples in this net, this energy grid of vibration and frequencies that echo what we can refer to as Shakti's primal force. It's a poetic bookend. It's a marker for renewal.
In the long form version of this study that you've put together, one of the sections is basically 6 decades of you charting celestial events and human affairs, impacting significant events, wars, natural disasters, all sorts of any sorts of significant life-changing events on Earth, seem to have some kind of connection, as it were, the sort of a symbiotic connection with events in the heavens, as above, so below. And so maybe you could pick out some of the details from that section.
Yes, certainly. I basically surveyed, using this Aquarian hunch, surveyed, events that have occurred between essentially 1968, 1970s up through today, pairing historical events with celestial beats.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com